Hello and welcome to Being Prodigy. Now put on your headphones and start learning. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description.
Work, Life and Leisure Cities in the Contemporary World in 1880, Durgacharan Ray wrote a novel, Devanar Martyagamon, The Gods Visit Earth, in which Brahma, the creator in Hindu mythology, took a train to Calcutta with some other gods, as Varuna, the rain god, conducted them around the capital of British India. The gods were wonderstruck by the big, modern city, the train itself, the large ships on the river Ganges, factories belching smoke, bridges and monuments, and a dazzling array of shops selling a wide range of commodities. The gods were so impressed by the marvels of the teeming metropolis that they decided to build a museum and a high court in heaven. The city of Calcutta in the 19th century was brimming with opportunities for trade and commerce, education and jobs, but the gods were disturbed by another aspect of city life, its cheats and thieves, its grinding poverty, and the poor quality of housing for many. Brahma himself got tricked into buying a pair of cheap glasses, and when he tried to buy a pair of shoes, he was greatly confused by the shopkeepers who accused one another of being swindlers. The gods were also perturbed at the confusion of caste, religious and gender identities in the city. All social distinctions that appeared to be natural and normal seemed to be breaking down. Like Durgacharan Ray, many others in 19th century India were both amazed and confused by what they saw in the cities. The city seemed to offer a series of contrasting images and experiences: wealth and poverty, splendor and dirt, opportunities and disappointments. Were cities always like the one described above? Though urbanization has a long history, the modern city worldwide has developed only over the last 200 years. Three historical processes have shaped modern cities in decisive ways: the rise of industrial capitalism, the establishment of colonial rule over large parts of the world, and the development of democratic ideals. This chapter will trace some of the processes of this urbanization. It will explore how the modern city emerges, and what happens within the city. Characteristics of the city to begin with. How do we distinguish between cities on the one hand and towns and villages on the other? Towns and cities that first appeared along river valleys, such as Ur, Nippur and Mohenjo-daro, were larger in scale than other human settlements. Ancient cities could develop only when an increase in food supplies made it possible to support a wide range of non-food producers. Sites were often the centers of political power, administrative network, trade and industry, religious institutions, and intellectual activity, and supported various social groups such as artisans, merchants and priests. Cities themselves can vary greatly in size and complexity. They can be densely settled modern-day metropolises, which combine political and economic functions for an entire region, and support very large populations, or they can be smaller urban centers with limited functions. This chapter will discuss the history of urbanization in the modern world. We will look in some detail at two modern cities as examples of metropolitan development. The first is London, the largest city in the world, and an imperial center in the 19th century, and the second is Bombay, one of the most important modern cities in the Indian subcontinent. Industrialization and the rise of the modern city in England. Industrialization changed the form of urbanization in the modern period.
This is Being Prodigy. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description, and please subscribe to show your support.
However, even as late as the 1850s, many decades after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, most Western countries were largely rural. The early industrial cities of Britain, such as Leeds and Manchester, attracted large numbers of migrants to the textile mills set up in the late 18th century. In 1851, more than three-quarters of the adults living in Manchester were migrants from rural areas. Now let us look at London. By 1750, 1 out of every 9 people of England and Wales lived in London. It was a colossal city with a population of about 675,000. Over the 19th century, London continued to expand. Its population multiplied fourfold in the 70 years between 1810 and 1880, increasing from 1 million to about 4 million. The City of London was a powerful magnet for migrant populations, even though it did not have large factories. 19th century London, says the historian Gareth Stedman Jones, was a city of clerks and shopkeepers, of small masters and skilled artisans, of a growing number of semi-skilled and sweated-out workers, off-soldiers and servants, of casual laborers, street sellers, and begarsaprik from the London dockyards. 5 major types of industries employed large numbers: clothing and footwear, wood and furniture, metals and engineering, printing and stationery, and precision products such as surgical instruments, watches, and objects of precious metal. 1862. During the First World War, 1914 to 1918, London began manufacturing motor cars and electrical goods, and the number of large factories increased until they accounted for nearly 1/3 of all jobs in the city. Marginal groups. As London grew, crime flourished. We are told that 20,000 criminals 1914 were living in London in the 1870s. We know a great deal about criminal activities in this period, for crime became an object of widespread concern. The police were worried about law and order, philanthropists were anxious about public morality, and industrialists wanted a hard-working and orderly labor force. So the population of criminals was counted, their activities were watched, and their ways of life were investigated. In the mid-19th century, Henry Mayhew wrote several volumes on the London labor, and compiled long lists of those who made a living from crime. Many of whom he listed as criminals were in fact poor people who lived by stealing lead from roofs, food from shops, lumps of coal, and clothes drying on hedges. There were others who were more skilled at their trade, expert at their jobs. They were the cheats and tricksters, pickpockets and petty thieves crowding the streets of London. In an attempt to discipline the population, the authorities imposed high penalties for crime and offered work to those who were considered the deserving poor. Factories employed large numbers of women in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. With technological developments, women gradually lost their industrial jobs and were forced to work within households. The 1861 census recorded 250,000 domestic servants in London, of whom the vast majority were women, many of them recent migrants. A large number of women used their homes to increase family income by taking in lodgers or through such activities as tailoring, washing or matchbox making. However, there was a change once again in the 20th century. As women got employment in wartime industries and offices, they withdrew from domestic service. Large number of children were pushed into low-paid work, often by their parents. Andrew Mearns, a clergyman who wrote The Bitter Cry of Outcast London in the 1880s, showed why crime was more profitable than laboring in small underpaid factories.
This is Being Prodigy. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description, and please subscribe to show your support.
A child 7 years old is easily known to make 10 shillings 6 pence a week from thieving. Before he can gain as much as the young thief, a boy must make 56 gross of matchboxes a week, or 1,296 a day. It was only after the passage of the Compulsory Elementary Education Act in 1870, and the Factory Acts beginning from 1902, that children were kept out of industrial work. Housing. Older cities like London changed dramatically when people began pouring in after the Industrial Revolution. Factory or workshop owners did not house the migrant workers. Instead, individual landowners put up cheap, and usually unsafe, tenements for the new arrivals. Although poverty was not unknown in the countryside, it was more concentrated and starkly visible in the city. In 1887, Charles Booth, a Liverpool ship owner, conducted the first social survey of low-skilled London workers in the East End of London. He found that as many as 1 million Londoners, about 1/5 of the population of London at the time, were very poor and were expected to live only up to an average age of 29, compared to the average life expectancy of 55 among the gentry and the middle class. These people were more than likely to die in a workhouse, hospital or lunatic asylum. London, he concluded, needed the rebuilding of at least 400,000 rooms to house its poorest citizens. For a while the better-off city dwellers continued to demand that slums simply be cleared away, but gradually a larger and larger number of people began to recognize the need for housing for the poor. What were the reasons for this increasing concern? First, the vast mass of one-room houses occupied by the poor were seen as a serious threat to public health. They were overcrowded, badly ventilated, and lacked sanitation. Second, there were worries about fire hazards created by poor housing. Third, there was a widespread fear of social disorder, especially after the Russian Revolution in 1917. Workers' mass housing schemes were planned to prevent the London poor from turning rebellious. Cleaning London. A variety of steps were taken to clean up London. Attempts were made to decongest localities, green the open spaces, reduce pollution and landscape the city. Large blocks of apartments were built, akin to those in Berlin and New York, cities which had similar housing problems. Rent control was introduced in Britain during the First World War to ease the impact of a severe housing shortage. The congestion in the 19th century industrial city also led to a yearning for clean country air. Many wealthy residents of London were able to afford a holiday home in the countryside. Demands were made for new lungs for the city, and some attempts were made to bridge the difference between city and countryside through such ideas as the Green Belt around London. Architect and planner Ebenezer Howard developed the principle of the Garden City, a pleasant space full of plants and trees, where people would both live and work. He believed this would also produce better quality citizens. Following Howard's ideas, Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker designed the Garden City of Newerswick. There were common garden spaces, beautiful views, and great attention to detail. In the end, only well-off workers could afford these houses. Between the two world wars, 1919 to 1939, the responsibility for housing the working classes was accepted by the British state, and 1 million houses, most of them single-family cottages, were built by local authorities. Meanwhile, the city had extended beyond the range where people could walk to work, and the development of suburbs made new forms of mass transport absolutely necessary. Transport in the city. How could people be persuaded to leave the city and live in garden suburbs unless there were some means of traveling to the city for work? The London Underground Railway partially solved the housing crisis by carrying large masses of people to and from the city.
This is Being Prodigy. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description. And please subscribe to show your support. Thank you and happy learning.